Well, today we have our friend joining us back on the program to give us his analysis of foreign affairs. We always like to hear what our guest today has to say because he tells it like it is and he's not afraid to ruffle feathers, especially when it comes to folks who are really, really wedded to the military industrial complex. We have Colonel Douglas Macgregor with us. How you doing, sir?
Very good. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you on. Now, we have a few things that are in the news related to foreign affairs that I want to get your thoughts on. First of all, what's made so much news and got a lot of people talking still is the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. Okay. He recently did his first interview, Tucker did his first interview about what he did in that interview at the World Government Summit, I believe, in Dubai. And there he made it clear that for all the people trying to criticize him for daring to interview Putin, he said, when my government spied on me, it made me that much more wanting to do it because I'm American and I believe in the American system of free press and freedom of interviews and freedom of expression. And I wanted to get into the mind of Vladimir Putin to hear his motives. That's it. And it's such a refreshing thing to hear that because you hear that from hardly anyone in the media today. So what were your thoughts on that whole exchange?
Well, I think Tucker is a very courageous individual. To do what he did took guts, and I think he did a good job. People will quibble with various things that went on during the interview. But, when you're interviewing a head of state, you can only push back so much against what the head of state says, because ultimately he's granting you a unique privilege to listen to him and
Right.
to hear his views. And, as I reflect on that interview, I think that Putin was trying to do a couple of things. First of all, he's trying to emphasize something that we don't understand, and that is that the Russian state has been in existence since the year 932. The Russian state has weathered lots of storms and made it this far, and it's not about to go out of business. And I think that was very helpful. I think his recounting of Tsarist Russian history was good. Where it fell apart, unfortunately, was after 1918, after the emergence of communism in Russia. And Putin ultimately decided to skip over it, trying to blame everything that was wrong in the world on the usual suspect, Adolf Hitler, when in reality, without communism that comes to power in Moscow in 1918, and the millions of people it slaughters in the ensuing 2 decades before the Second World War, there wouldn't have been a Second World War. He didn't bother to point out that Stalin was only too eager to help liquidate Poland because in addition to gobbling up half of Poland, thanks to his agreement with Adolf Hitler, he also moved in and seized Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and half of Finland. And millions of people disappeared into the Gulag system. We can't gloss over those things. It's unfortunate that Tucker couldn't have raised that issue with him because sadly, that is a legacy that Russia continues to struggle with. Communism, Stalin, and the mass murders, orchestrated famines, incarcerations, deportations, and shootings that took the lives of millions and millions and millions of people. And this thing that everyone keeps insisting is the Great Patriotic War was not as he describes it. It was hardly the Great Patriotic Event. Ultimately, you can't go into these things, but, he could have pushed back a little bit on that. Otherwise, I think that Putin had the opportunity to point out what has happened since 1992. And he accurately depicted the series of events that led up to his intervention in eastern Ukraine. Now, it would have been helpful if Tucker had said, were you surprised by what happened when your forces went into eastern Ukraine? Because I think he was. I don't think he expected the quality of the resistance that he encountered. He obviously didn't expect to fight a long war because it became very clear after the first 90 days to 180 days that this was going to be a long war. And he had to essentially back up, reconsider all of his assumptions, build up the force. I think that would have been useful simply because, you hear from people over and over and over again, well, Putin is this dangerous aggressor. Putin wants to attack Western Europe. It's all nonsense. had no intention of doing so. You can't have it both ways. You can't have it on the one hand say, well, Russia is weak, enfeebled, incapable, its armed forces are incompetent, and then turn around and say Russia presents this great danger to the West. Well, neither was true. The other thing is that he could have done a better job of pointing out that despite all of the sanctions, despite everything that we've undertaken to harm and destroy Russia, it hasn't worked. It's been an abysmal failure. And Russia today is stronger as a society, stronger as a state, and stronger in every economic category of power that it has been probably in decades. So, it would have been good if those things could have come out. But on the other hand, as I said before, how much can you as an interviewer push your head of state to tell you? But I think on the whole, it was successful because I think people did get a glimpse, those that listened to it and paid attention, of reality. And reality is what your opponent thinks. It's not what you think. And that I think was a crowning achievement. Will go down in history as a very positive development.
Yeah, it was interesting. He said, do you see the act of God moving in the affairs of men? And he said something more like, no, I just see it like there's a series of laws that governments have. And so it kind of reminded me of the bureaucrat mind of Vladimir Putin. He's just looking at, he's like, technically you failed on this term. And, he's a bureaucrat. He's negotiating the terms of international law as he sees it from his perspective. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. On the other hand, he has done a great deal to restore Orthodox Christianity to its rightful place in Russian identity, culture, and history. So I think the Russians are grateful for that. It's astonishing when you think for 70 years, the population of the Soviet Union, whether it was Christian or Muslim or anything else, was essentially governed by an atheistic, materialistic regime that felt nothing but contempt for religion and for God. Now, all of a sudden, you have the opposite. And I was a little surprised at his answer, but I would tell you, we don't know how that question was translated. Again, if you're not fluent in the language, and I do speak German, so I listen a great deal to things that are said in German, and then I look at the English translations, they're frequently misleading. So it could be that he didn't interpret the question in the way that I think Tucker meant it.
Yeah.
Because if there's one thing that Vladimir Putin is, he's an Orthodox Christian.
Right. Well, it seems like maybe I was wondering that too, if maybe he thought he was saying, like, do you think God's design is behind what you've been doing lately? Like you've got some kind of mandate from heaven in your wars. Maybe he was trying to downplay any kind of theological vision. I don't know, but it didn't seem to be. I thought I don't. But then again, I think he's pragmatic. I mean, it's like Donald Trump. Donald Trump, he does things that folks in evangelical America appreciate, but he doesn't couch his language saying, hey, look, I have been inspired by God to do this. He usually uses more pragmatic business type language, whereas Putin as a bureaucrat, he's going to use more international law language. You know what I mean? So,
no, I think that's true. And the other thing is that if he had spoken along the lines that you're talking about, people would have dismissed him as some sort of unserious religious fanatic.
Right.
How many times has someone stood up and said, I prayed about something, I thought about it long and hard, and I came to this conclusion because I was convinced after prayer and listening to my inner voice, listening effectively to the divine, that this is what I should do. You don't hear it very much because you're going to be castigated for saying that. Who are you? Oh, so God speaks to you?
Yeah.
You mean God speaks to you only? You're the one? You're in trouble right away. People just heap abuse on you. So that may have been part of it, but I just don't know what the original question sounded like in Russian.
Yeah.
I do know that Vladimir Putin is a serious Orthodox Christian.
Do you think that with the interview that has probably to me, I was looking at the way he reflected on his interview in that interview he did in Dubai. I think it was Dubai, but he said basically, I wanted to just show people the other side's perspective and they can come up with their own conclusions. And he said, in the way he said, I think Putin is the interviewer for Tucker said, do you think this is a person, having done the interview and your conversation with him afterwards, that is seriously open to compromise with the West? And he said, I think so. And I thought, when I was watching Tucker, I said, this is what it looks like. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall inherit the earth. Because Tucker doesn't have to do this. He could ride off into the sunset and be very comfortable doing what he's already done. He's made millions. He's had all the success. He could do a lot more easier interviews. He could play it safe, but he's playing a high stakes game for peace, and that's a commendable role.
Tucker Carlson offends the left and the swamp in general, because Tucker Carlson is a man of character.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I mean by that? Exactly what you just said. This is nothing that he had to do. This was not an exercise in grandstanding by any means. But he believes in his country, but he also is unlike the people in Washington. He's not interested in compelling anyone else on the planet to, quote unquote, imitate us. Somebody said, well, you think Russia is better than America because its cities are cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
That's absurd. Not at all. Our society, and everybody in the United States knows this, is imperfect. Gosh, what a shocking revelation. We are imperfect. So is Russian society. The Russians are not claiming to be perfect. The Russians are not insisting that they are a model for us. We're the ones that run all over the world and constantly tell everybody we are morally superior.
Yeah.
And we therefore have the right to meddle in your internal affairs. That's all nonsense. It's been nonsense from the beginning. And we need to stop it. And I think Tucker was essentially saying that. That was his message. By the way, I'm old enough to remember when the town that I grew up in, Philadelphia, was actually pretty clean and had very little crime. So there you go.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's very few times in that Dubai audience that they did any applause for Tucker. The one time they gave him big applause is very noticeable. The rapturous applause that Tucker received from that largely foreign audience when he said, I love America and I want it to live up to its best moral virtues that it was always about in the beginning. And I thought, man, that shows you there's a lot of latent goodwill that foreigners still have to see America kind of step up and reclaim some of its founding principles, and live up to them.
I think that's true. I think that's true everywhere we go. And I think the question that has to be answered is the one that no one in Washington ever asks. But Putin did. He said, what are you doing here? What are you doing in Ukraine?
Yeah.
What is your business here?
Yeah.
And he pointed out that this was, in many respects, a civil war.
Right.
And he talked about that. In other words, you have serious problems at home. What are you doing about those? Yet you're willing to spend a fortune here on a regime that's corrupt, that is a puppet state, for the purpose of harming us? Why? What's the point? And I think that, in effect, is why you got the response that Tucker got in Dubai. He simply said, look, I want my country to be what it claims to be. We need to get back to that. Washington and Hamilton both disagreed with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, by the way, wanted us to join, believe it or not, the French Revolution.
Yeah.
It was murdering people by the thousands.
Yeah.
It then went on to launch wars all over Europe. And Washington and Hamilton took the position, let's build our country. If we're successful in our country, we build ourselves up economically, we're prosperous, we have the rule of law, others will see it, and they will want to emulate it. We don't need to carry a message into a foreign country at the point of a bayonet. We don't want to do that. That's not what we're about. We've forgotten that. Washington and Hamilton were right. We got to get back to it. We've been living with the Jeffersonian stream of consciousness in our foreign policy now for more than a century. It's got to go away quickly before we go away.
Yeah. Do you think that interview and the fallout from it will move the needle towards a closer resolution, a quicker resolution maybe in this Ukraine conflict? As we're talking right now, the Senate, I believe, is still deliberating over to pass this foreign aid package that's a scam what is it, $100 billion for Ukraine, tying Trump's hands so that it basically sets him up for impeachment if he doesn't fulfill the goodies into the next term, if he gets in there. This disaster, it's got aid to the Israel-Gaza thing. It's got aid, and it's got this kind of a scam border relief package. Where do you think that perhaps the tide is turning here? I mean, we've got a couple senators in there trying to do the right thing. A few of them are voting against it, but still not enough to maybe stop it. What do you see here?
David, nothing is going to change in the short term.
Yeah.
I think it was Mark Twain who said the only truly criminal class in America is Congress.
Yeah.
That certainly applies to the Senate. It is hopelessly corrupt. They are not paying any attention to what Americans think or need or want. If you were to put it to a vote, across the country, no one would vote for war in Ukraine. I don't think people would vote more aid to Israel. They would look at what's happening over there and say, enough is enough. This has nothing to do with defending your country. Somebody asked me, can you think of a way to frame this? And I said, sure. Every year, we lose 100,000 plus Americans to fentanyl poisoning. Now, much of that fentanyl poisoning comes from where? Mexico. So the solution is to bomb the hell out of Mexico, right? Wrong. That is not the solution. The solution is to get control of your border. The solution is to clean up the criminality in our own country, deal with this problem here, and to the extent that we are able to support anti-criminal activities in Mexico. The solution to dealing with Hamas is not to create millions of Muslim martyrs, to destroy lives by the hundreds of thousands. I mean, King Abdullah yesterday said that the numbers of Arabs, Christians, and Muslims who have been killed, wounded, or otherwise missing is now about 100,000. Well, that's outrageous. This is in response to 7 October. And not everything that happened on 7 October was accurately reported, by the way. A lot of that's being debunked. That notwithstanding, what happened on 7 October was terrible. And Israel was justified in adopting measures to defend itself against Hamas. But what Israel set out to do and what it has done to this point is simply unjustified. And I don't think most Americans would support the transfer of billions of dollars to Israel to carry on this exercise in mass killing and expulsion. Just as I don't think Americans would want this Ukrainian regime kept in power. What I think they would much prefer is to see an end to the war. And Americans are very generous people. You know that, David. Americans are always willing to step forward and say, end this war and we'll help you rebuild. End this fighting and we will assist you in recovery. That's our nature. That's the way we are. That's what our belief system involves. And I think a great deal of that can be traced to our Christianity as a foundational principle in the United States. But this business of killing and destroying is not something that Americans want to underwrite. And I think Americans are if they're beginning to figure out anything, they're beginning to figure out that the last 20 years have been disastrous for us. I mean, whatever we said we were going to do after 9/11 has created millions and millions of new enemies needlessly and bankrupted us. What are the latest figures? 14 trillion wasted on these various interventions and so-called global war on terror. And what do we get for it? Does anybody ever sit down and ask how many hospitals could have been built? How much better our educational system might be? I mean, nobody raises those. So I guess the answer is we need to do exactly what Vladimir Putin suggested. We need to think about our own problems, and we should help people find a way to end this thing. But it's not going to happen. No one in Washington will stand up and accept responsibility for having been wrong.
Yeah, well, that's why Tucker said at the end of his interview, he said, "What if you would you accept a deal where we say NATO won and this just?"
I think Putin probably sat there and said privately, I could care less as long as this ends.
Right.
But the truth is that Tucker was onto something.
Yeah.
Go back to 2022 in January.
Yeah.
And in January of 2022, the great men of Washington were all saying two things. First of all, the Russians will never invade. They will never do this. They realize what a terrible risk this is. They are too vulnerable. their financial system will collapse. Their economy will collapse. Their armed forces are incapable, and so forth. All right, where are we today? We found out all of that is wrong. Someone sent me an estimate yesterday that there's at least $75 trillion in terms of natural resources, mineral deposits in Russia that have not even been tapped. You know, Russia is not a country you can isolate and destroy. It's impossible. So we've learned that lesson. Now we're looking at the Middle East, and we've convinced ourselves, well, the Arabs aren't going to do anything. They're incompetent. The Muslims can't do anything. The Turks can't do anything. The Iranians can't do anything. No one will dare challenge us. The Israelis can do what they want as long as we support them. Well, I think they're making a miscalculation, because I think this Muslim world is uniting. It's coalescing in ways that we have not seen, I would say, for hundreds of years. And I think the consequences will be profound as the consequences were for Ukraine. So we've got to be very careful of the people in Washington, because they are suddenly overnight, regardless of the topic, experts on everything. Guess what? They're not.
Yeah. There's related to that topic you just raised there. The Times of Israel has a story. Egypt says peace treaty with Israel safe despite jitters over the Rafah offensive. Foreign Minister Shokri appears to rebuff reports that Cairo could suspend agreement if IDF pushes into southern Gaza City, risking influx into Sinai. So that's got people rattled there a little bit, that news. There was another headline says, Egypt threatens, this is Voice of America, that Egypt threatens to suspend peace treaty with Israel. Egypt on edge, CNN says, as Israel's war presses more than 1 million Palestinians up against its border. What do you see unfolding here?
Well, they're all right. Everybody said something that is true. On the one hand, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, these countries already have very large populations that they struggle to feed and clothe and house. They're not interested in going to war. The Egyptian population in 1973, at the end of the 73 war, was roughly 40 million. And the literacy rate was, I think, somewhere around 40%. Today, there are 100 million Egyptians, and the literacy rate is up in the 80s. Now, my point is that things have changed in the region. This thing that we constantly obsess over called the cell phone, everybody's got it. And everybody has access to information and news. Now, we don't always have access to everything we'd like, but my point is the world has changed. And Sisi in Egypt, who absolutely does not want a war, is in a very dangerous position, because his population is quietly enraged by what they are seeing. Remember, Mr. Netanyahu turned to the entire Islamic world and effectively said, you are animals. You deserve to be destroyed. That's not likely to cultivate very many friends in the Islamic world. Now, they are killing people.
And you're kind of referencing the Amalek reference that he made,
yes,
right?
Yeah. And tens of thousands of the people dying in Gaza are women and children. That's a fact. That's not fantasy. You put this together, and the population of Islam is aware, understands this. If their leaders fail to act against this, they will be removed from power. Those are the facts. And Sisi in particular is very concerned about it. Now, Mr. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has been very vocal in his criticism of Israel. He has promised that the day is coming when Turkish soldiers will fight in Gaza. He said that. He meets with the president of Egypt, General Sisi, on Wednesday, tomorrow. And he has said in his cabinet meeting, the top issue for discussion is Gaza. Now, why would the Egyptian president want a meeting with Mr. Erdogan? Because Mr. Erdogan has the largest army in NATO, because the Turkish military establishment is powerful, it's modern, it's capable. There is no one more capable in the region than the Turks. Together with the Turks, you have the Iranians. The Iranians have held back, but they too have condemned what's happening in Gaza. And no one should exclude the possibility that if the Israelis attack Hezbollah, and there's been a lot of talk about that in Israel, moving to the north now, Having destroyed as much as they can down south, they move north and they invade southern Lebanon. That would bring in Iran. Now, this is unnecessary. My point is, you don't need to be a genius to figure out where the cards, so to say, are going to fall. We know exactly how this goes down. Israel may not survive this outcome. That should be at the top of everybody's concern. What is the first obligation of every head of state in strategy? To ensure the survival of his state. You don't put your country at risk unnecessarily. Everything is calculated. And wars have a bad habit of moving in directions that nobody thinks will happen. Somebody said years ago, I think it was Enoch Powell, history is littered with wars that everyone said would never happen. And the same people that said the Russians will never go in to eastern Ukraine, and the Russians are incapable and they will fail, are saying there will be no regional war in the Middle East. The Israelis can kill these people to their heart's content and no one will interrupt. That's wrong. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous for them. It's dangerous for us, David.
Yeah, Al Jazeera has a story. Iran simulates strike on Israeli base as it showcases its naval force. This comes at the same time that the AP is reporting the head of UN's nuclear watchdog warns Iran is not entirely transparent on its atomic program. So, White House, meanwhile, is warning the Republicans because they know who, how their fundraising goes, that not passing this supplemental will help Iran. So they're trying to give them a little.
Yeah, I mean, if you've threatened and bullied and sanctioned and bombed for decades and it hasn't worked, what do? You sanction and bully and bomb. Mm-hmm. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
You threaten.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. The world has changed. These are not the backwaters that they were 40 or 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. The populations are better educated. There are very sophisticated, technically competent people out there.
Yeah.
The notion that we can treat them as though they were no more than tribes on a reservation is fundamentally false and dangerous. And yet that's the attitude right now in Washington. So the bottom line is, David, we're at a very dangerous crossroads right now. Sometimes I'm reminded of that statement that came out of the Vietnam War. Somebody said, well, we had to destroy the village in order to save it. Sometimes I think that this administration and their friends in Washington, Republicans and Democrats, have all concluded that we have to destroy America in order to save it.
Yeah. I think
that's what I see going on.
I think they don't look at America as something that's worth saving. They see it as an asset of the New World Order that they are more in alignment with. Really, they just kind of they'll sell it for scraps if they have to. For scrap.
Oh, sure. I've had people tell me to my face, "Who are you kidding, Doug? Who are the American people you talk about? Who are these people? They don't exist. They don't even know who they are." Yeah. And I said repeatedly, just because large numbers of men with guns have not shown up to restore Thomas Jefferson's memorial, to restore Lincoln's memorial, to halt the dismantling of the Confederate memorials that were down south, which incidentally all were put up as symbols of reconciliation between the North and the South after the Civil War. Yeah. That's why they're there. I say, just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean that if you push hard enough that you won't discover that there is an American population. They're real. They call themselves Americans. They're not hybrids. They're not something else in Americans. They're just Americans. They're out there. We know that. You know that. I know that. But people in Washington don't think so.
Yeah. Let's hope that perhaps, one of the positive silver linings that's developed here, and we'll land the plane here, is this notion that the anti-war left is starting to wake up again after the overreach in Gaza, after so many kids. You're starting to see them really animated against Biden's actions here. And one wonders if they'll start to remember, oh, wait, we're supposed to oppose the Iran war too. And, oh, wait, well, I guess maybe this Russian thing is overblown too. You can only hope. I don't know. It's not that hard to connect the dots to say, wait a second, rah, go kill the Russians in Ukraine. And then no, don't do the war in Iran, and no, let's not keep the thing in Gaza going. It's like that's not that hard of a mental, logical next step there, you know?
No, I
So,
think you're right. And that's why our country, our choice, we say God, family, country. You don't have to be a Republican. You don't have to be a Democrat. You don't have to be an independent. You can be whatever you want. But I think those of us who are Americans can agree on that simple statement: God, family, country. We have to get back to it. We have to think in those terms. If we start to think in those terms, I think most of these wars that we have launched overseas will end
yeah.
because they're not necessary. And we have more important things here at home.
How can people get involved with your group, Our Country, Our Choice? What's coming up? Anything going on that
Well, a
people should
couple
be
of
aware
quick
of?
points I would say is, first of all, we're up to about 180,000 members. We're
Wow.
trying to reach millions, and there's a reason for that. We need millions of members because numbers actually give you weight in terms of your influence in Washington. And secondly, we're trying to recruit people not just to go to rallies and feel good or wear funny hats. We are trying to recruit people that will step forward, that we can put into jobs, appointed, elected, otherwise, in Washington to replace this monstrosity called the swamp. Literally, we want people to come in. I keep telling people, every time you turn around and you look at somebody who's being considered for a job in Washington, well, let's look at his or her CV. Let's look at his or her resume. Where have they been? These people are all carbon copies. They all went to the same schools in the Ivy League or the service academies. Don't bring them in anymore.
Yeah.
They have done a terrible job. Somebody says, well, how do you know you're going to find qualified people outside the Beltway? Well, if you're an American who loves his or her country, you can distinguish right from wrong. You don't think that men have babies. You think that they're men and women. Then, gosh, I think you're probably qualified to do a job in Washington, because we got a lot of people there who are confused.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's also what Our Country, Our Choice is about. So you can go to ourcountryourchoice.com, look over the website. I think your viewers or your listeners will like it. They should join and understand that our long-term plan is to replace the swamp. That's what we want to do. We want to get rid of it, and we want to replace it with Americans like us. People like you, like me, like many of us listening right now.
Well, I appreciate your time, sir. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, always a pleasure to talk with you. We'll talk again soon.